Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this fascinating conversation that we're going to have with Jacob Soll on can we make accountable societies. For those of you who are new to the Blavatnik School, this is one of the newest establishments here within the University of Oxford. The Blavatnik School was created with a vision to improve governments across the world, and we have a flagship Master of Public Policy program that attracts students from dozens of countries every year. So we invite you to learn more about the Blavatnik School on our website. This talk will be live streamed on YouTube. So after Professor Soll's remarks, we will do Q&A with the audience. And if you do have a question, we'd ask for you to wait so that we can bring a microphone for you. Otherwise, the people who are watching this online won't be able to hear your question. With that, let me jump right in and introduce Jacob Soll. Jacob is a university professor of history, philosophy, and accounting at the University of Southern California, and also a MacArthur award-winning historian for his book, The Reckoning, which is on the history of public accountability. Jacob is one of those rare and unique individuals who's been able to write a book on public financial management that is not a textbook and that has yet sold 90,000 copies. So there must be something here that we have to learn. He's writing his next book, which is called Free Markets, The History of a Dream, the history of a dream. Jacob's presentation today will be taking us on the journey between The Reckoning and the new book on free markets. So very much looking forward to it. So Jacob's going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes uninterrupted, and then he will sit down here with me for Q&A. So take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you. Karthik's an old friend. We've been on the circuit together for a while. And it's great to see him here in Oxford, although I went to Cambridge and I normally never come to Oxford. But I am going to be coming back, actually. I'm going to be coming back because Cambridge is just too small. It's too small.
There you go.
I'm from California now, and we need a little more size. So this is what I want to present to you today, basically, is a sort of funny story, because it is a story that starts in early modern history. It starts in kind of old school, hardcore archival research. And by literally just a twist of fate, it ended up taking me into the world of on-the-ground policymaking. And it's been a kind of wild ride. I'm still on it, although I'm trying to finish my new book, which is an old-style research book. But I'm still doing government policy work, and I'm still learning from it. And it's been absolutely fascinating to do both. And one of the things that Karthik and I were talking about is how, something that's actually overlooked is how effective history is as a policy language, because it is nonpartisan. And what I have found is it doesn't lull people, but politicians and even members of the public are sometimes more open to historical discourse than they are to what they might consider to be political discourse. And I found this especially in negotiating reforms with people, with literally people governing governments, that this can fail, but it can also work as a language of reform. And that has been sort of fascinating. And I want to sort of take you through that a little bit. So I'm obsessed. It's actually interesting because my whole life I've been obsessed by free countries and democracies and how they succeed and fail. And I never thought that I'd be living what I'm living in the United States right now, which is the teetering on the edge of the rule of law at the highest levels of government. I mean, I don't mean in the traditional way. I mean in a more sort of up-at-night, terrified way. I say that seriously, actually. I really do. But one of the things I wanted to do as a historian was try and understand the stability of government. So what I would do is I'd go into government archives and I'd look at papers. For example, Philip II of Spain, who's actually a Burgundian, because he was from Burgundy, they wrote some of the most beautiful legislation you've ever seen in your life. Much of it actually about financial management and accounting. By the way, I use public financial management because on the road, what we have found, this team that I've worked with, is that if we say accounting, people go, oh. And if we say public financial management, they go, huh, which is more, and we found that we actually then did a test of students, and they found public financial management to be positive and accounting to be negative, which is part of the subject of my book, of why people can't handle accounting. But so, for example, he writes beautiful legislation, which he can never apply, but boy, Burgundians know how to write legislation. So what I did is I went into a number of governments that I consider to be essential in the Western tradition of building government. These are the chapters that you read when you're a student of the history of government to understand how governments usually work or the evolution towards the modern state. What I found in these archives at every single point was that accounting was absolutely central and that public financial management was absolutely essential, that it was discussed, it was openly legislated, it was seen as the key. And in my book, I take you all over at least the European and North American world where this is the case. What I did find is much of the obvious, and that is in absolutist governments, even though they could write beautiful legislation, they often, and they could sometimes do remarkable reforms, they often didn't last because accounting does not do well without public reckonings. That's what it's sort of all about. Without transparency, it doesn't work for long. And that's a kind of short story of the absolutist part of the book. So what I wanted to talk about today was what worked historically what worked, and how that sort of allows us to start approaching what might work now in a time when many people feel that we don't have accountability, there's that feeling that we don't have it, and in fact, most people have forgotten the language of accountability. And I think in English, if I give this speech if you give this speech in a Latin language, they don't have the word accountability. You have responsabilité in French, and that leads down. But by the way, the word accountability does come from French, as many English words do. I know that's hard to handle. And we think the word accountability becomes used more generally with the popularization of a translation of the French Revolutionary Constitution of 1793, which had a section called à comptabilité, which was about public accounting in the state. And that turns into accountability. Even though the OED has a 17th century usage, we think that it really comes from this moment. So accountability politically historically comes from accounting, comes from a language of accounting. And one of the central things of accounting that makes accounting work is you can be a good accountant, but as I've said, without some kind of auditing system, it doesn't last for long, even if you use high standards. So while auditors don't like to be called accountants, I still call them accountants. And that's something that when I speak to auditors, I'm told not to call them accountants. But I'm in this room with you now, so I'm doing that. Basically, at the same time, one of the things I found is that you actually need to have a culture of accountability, which historically I found to be a culture of accounting. And I want to sort of tell you that story. And this really just takes us to sort of one anecdote, which I'll have time to tell you today, which is the Dutch audit of 1622. And this is the first time that you have a large-scale public audit. Even in medieval Italy, when you had the catasto, they were not truly public audits. They did not actually have citizens calling for the government to audit a large entity that was partially private, partially governmental. And this story I want to tell you today. In 1622, the shareholders of the Dutch East India Company call for an audit, and they get it. And I'm going to swing back and tell you that story. How on earth do they actually get there? That's a remarkable thing. And this is this is truly the first grand public audit of a company, but also actually of a government entity, because the Dutch East India Company was supported by the government. It actually governs, but it's a private company. It's very complex. So Holland, really between 1530 and I would say 1700s, the richest place in the world per capita. In fact, this gives Holland, it has the longest running, as I'm sure you know, Gini factor of any country in the world. 1 million to 1.2 million people, producing more wealth than any place on earth. and controlling more moving wealth per capita than anywhere on Earth for about 200 years. The Dutch East India Company brings in between 9 and 18% returns for 100 years. That's without actually faking their books. So that's, of course, mostly they're selling slaves, among other things, and that's a profitable business. But that's not for a government school. That's a business school topic. Sorry. I'm free, you guys. I can say what I want. What I want to talk to you is about this Dutch culture of accountability. After studying all these failed countries that failed to actually implement double entry accrual accounting as a tool of management and open audits within their governmental system, i.e. an internal control system that would allow them to govern effectively for a long period of time. Do people get that concept? So what you use accounting is public financial management in this case, and if you use a certain kind of accounting, it allows you to actually manage your money not just in the present, but also going into the future quite effectively, and especially if it's transparent. And so I was looking, as I said, for how that worked. The Dutch did it. And so after looking at these countries that failed, France and other countries, I got to Holland. And I started finding things. I didn't find just legislation. I didn't find a few manuals, although, by the way, Pacioli is not the father of accounting, really. He just wrote a manual. The Dutch are the people that spread double entry accrual accounting to England, Germany, and the rest of the world. So I started literally just finding all this culture of accounting and accountability. This is an early painting. This is at the Met in New York, 1530. This guy, by the way, I am sorry for all the Weber fans in the room, and I know there are many here. I see the sweatshirts, the Max Weber sweatshirts. This guy's probably Catholic because he's south of Antwerp, and everyone south of Antwerp is Catholic. So, but this is how the Dutch saw themselves in the Renaissance. These Dutch merchants, if you went to Germany or even Italy, they painted themselves as being wealthy. These guys paint themselves with their tech. Okay, this is a computer. Computare in Latin, of course, means to account, right? And you see the double entry books, you see the receipts, you see literally the creation and the working of double entry. You see the wealth, okay? Ermine. Ermine's a nice thing. People forget ermine these days. I guess that's not politically correct either. Even fake ermine, okay? But the word ermine has lost its luster. I still say ermine. There are the jewels. But there are loads of these paintings, and the computer, because that's what the accounting system is always in the background. This is the definitive painting, 1514, you guys. This is the Middle Ages here, and look at this. This is, a prayer book, and or a psalm book, and look at this technology behind them. The technology will, as time goes on, start taking a bigger role. The prayer book is replaced with an account book. Once again, they're showing their skill, they're advertising it. But something happens with the Dutch, and this is where we get into the accountability thing. Remember Antwerp. People in Antwerp before are still Catholics. So the birth of this modern capitalistic tool is not happening through Protestants. It's complex. And we could talk about the history of Protestantism and capitalism I could talk about it for 11 and a half straight hours, as long as you gave me enough to drink. What happens is amongst this canon of paintings, by the way, if you go to the Fine Arts Museum in Brussels, you'll see these paintings. You see the computing, but you also see now the warning. Some people think this is an anti-Semitic picture, but I'm not so sure. There's a snake. It's something to say, watch out. This is also can be used for fourberie, des fourbes. It can also be used to fool you, but it can also, this is the finest painting we actually have of a double entry sort of paper system. And so historians of paperwork and computing love these paintings. But of course, the people are insane. They've lost their minds. And these are warnings about hubris. And this is, of course, something we all know is very important today in modern business schools, is teaching you about obviously the dangers of hubris, right? And we're all worried about hubris all the time, especially at the finest universities in the world, where we resist hubris all the time. So here's a culture where you're seeing these phenomenal paintings, where it's a huge cultural investment. What do we invest our culture in? Actually, in this city, maybe you could come up with a good response. Where I live in LA, the answer is really, really depressing, okay? But this is a huge cultural investment, not just to talk about public financial management or accounting, or in this case, private financial management, but about hubris and folly, and that humans who get too good at this can lose their minds. This painting is in Bruges. You actually can't see it so well. The money is here on the back of the painting, are all the buildings, the public buildings that this merchant has built. He can't balance his books because the guy who owes him the money is dead. Only death can balance your books, which is a theme from the Bible when God does the final reckoning. So that's a nice old theme from both Judaism and Christianity. So the Dutch are painting these paintings, and I'm fascinated by this. And so I go back and I do the work that I'd been doing in the other governments. I start going through the government papers, the legislation, and looking at the political culture. The leaders of the Dutch Republic, the Dutch Republic begins in 1581. In 1585, the Spanish sack Antwerp. It goes from a city of 100,000 to 40,000. Most of those people move to the Dutch Republic, where many of them become accounting masters. And again, I hate to scare you, but the cities, that means governments, start hiring accounting masters in all the municipalities they can for the public, so that when children walk out of their Latin classes, because the Dutch Republic is incredibly literate, just like Tuscany was in the Middle Ages and remained. Tuscany has one of the longest running high literacy levels in the history of humanity, both reading literacy, but also financial calculation, accounting literacy as well. So the government says, look, we want the kids to come out of their humanist classes where they've learned ethics and they've learned the quadrivium and the trivium. We want them to then walk into an accounting school, a reckoning school. So the government actually says, we're going to actually make this happen. We know that the Dutch are remarkably literate in accounting. Simon Stevin is the sort of head minister. He's the head humanist. He's a philologist. He's a translator of ancient works. He's also a sort of semi-water physicist who runs the waterworks. He runs the Navy, and he also runs educational policy. And he writes the big manual on accounting for the time, which is called the New Instructions for Princes to Learn Accounting. But that's a rhetorical move to say not only should the stadtholder learn accounting, because he taught the stadtholder how to do double entry accounting, but citizens should know it. All citizens should know it because they have to actually help manage the state, and therefore, if they're literate, they can do their job. Not just doing actual commerce, but it's also for managing the state. And I can tell another long story about how the polder system and the waterworks dating from the 1100s are communally run and funded by Dutch provincial taxes, which are the best collected taxes in Europe, the most stable, and in fact, interest rates in Europe are pegged to those taxes for 200 years at 4%, because they're so, and we're now actually, my colleagues in Holland are doing the first study of these taxes to see if they're managed in double entry. Some aren't and some are. But it's a very high level. No one else is managing their public finance to this level. So he says, look, the whole society needs this. And this is this kind of leader of the society. So he's not only building the waterworks in Holland, which is existential, he's doing the other existential chapter, which is the creation of this accounting policy and the running of these accounting schools. Prince Maurice did, in fact, learn accounting. They were at university together, which happened in Holland. A commoner and the Prince of Orange would go to university together because wealth inequality in 16th century Holland might actually have been much better than it is today. Wealth equality. In 2000, and I think it's 2006, some colleagues in The Hague found Prince Maurice's account books Anyone who ever ran a traditional business or knows how to do real accounting can see those are beautiful books. He didn't write them, but we know, we've seen annotations. He could read them and he could audit them. So what happens is there is a literal awareness in the society that this literacy at all levels of society, and by the way, we have evidence of everyone from Spinoza to prostitutes who are saying, I know how to do accounting, and we've seen the account books. Everybody knows how to do it. Bricklayers, merchants, princes. This is a society that knows how to do accounting, and they write songs and poems about it too. Not just those paintings. It's in popular culture, as it will be in British 18th century culture too, where you go to a bar and people are singing about accounting, just like here at Oxford. That's what, I mean, when you go to California, obviously you go to Disney World, there's the whole accounting section. And now, of course, what this means is that in this society, which is very small, everyone knows that everyone knows accounting. So when the Dutch East India Company is founded in 1602, for some people who are historians of slavery get very upset at this. This is a complex company, and it does make its money in the flesh trade, okay? It makes it in other ways too, but selling human chattels where the cash is. But the creation of the Dutch East India Company mirrors the creation of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which is no longer a bourse. A bourse is where you go to actually exchange things. It's where you go to actually sell pieces of paper that are supposed to represent parts in a company. By the way, who here would go on the stock market openly today and just buy some stocks without insider knowledge? Reading the Financial Times, forget that. I'm trying to think of a newspaper that would have useful financial knowledge in it. And I can't think of one. The Wall Street Journal, not so much. I don't know, some specialist journal. Would you say, that small tire company in India is really looking hot, and I'm going to invest 275,000 pounds in it right now? Do you have the trust? By the way, do you think that the most wealthy people in the world choose their stocks by actually just open reports? The trust that it takes to buy stocks is based on an idea that the information that you're getting, that the balance sheets that you're seeing are trustworthy and some kind of reflection of income, expenditures, assets, and liabilities of the company. If you looked at the balance sheet of Westinghouse today, do you think it would show all of its liabilities on its balance sheet? I'm getting business school here. No, they don't have to show it, so I wouldn't recommend it. I just wouldn't recommend it. What you need is a team of analysts to go in and actually do a forensic study of the company and figure out where their liabilities are. And for that, you're going to need a whole bunch of money. So open stock investment's probably not a great idea for the average citizen. My friends who are fabulously wealthy don't recommend buying stocks without teams studying them for years. They don't mess around with that. In fact, they're not so hot on stocks. They say buy your own company. It's much better. So it takes an enormous amount of trust to get here. You have a society in which people trust things enough to make to do these kinds of transactions. One of the things that happens is the Dutch East India Company starts losing money for about several years. Their stock return goes down to 6%, 4%. There are stories of insider trading. And what happens is they call for a reckoning, a public audit. They do a public audit. Prince Moritz actually does the audit. They trust him, and he says, look, I can't do it publicly because trade secrets and military secrets are here, but you can trust me to do it because you know I know accounting, and you know I will do a proper reckoning. And they do it, and they turn the company and the state around. They're able to actually reform from the first shareholders' revolt to the first basic audit by a state of a company. They turn it around, and the Dutch East India goes back to, doing what it does at a very profitable level. Now, the question is, so here's that story, but we're running short on time. This is a staggering story. By the way, there are hundreds of these paintings from public institutions in Holland of people with keeping double entry books, but showing them and saying, "Shao, look, audit me." Ah, women, early 17th century. Benjamin Franklin said, always hire a Dutch man because he comes with a Dutch woman and she's literate and she can do financial management. That's how you get rich. There ain't nowhere in the world that's doing this. A few Quaker women are keeping books at this point, but no other women are. This is a highly advanced society. And oh, lo and behold, here are our books. Look at our books. Look, they're open for you to see. By the 18th century, it becomes a false offer because the whole state in Holland becomes so corrupt. But in the 17th century, it's really real. So you have this society which is comfortable not only with accounting, but with the concept of an audit. Do you understand audits? Is it a part of common culture today? Well, we know that it's not. And we know, one of the things my book showed, and I will jump now, is that this was absolutely essential to good governance. By the way, it will go to England. That's a Dutch king that England has. And the British emulate Dutch accounting culture. And they have a similar phenomenon where accounting becomes part of English culture. It becomes part of the English governing class. It becomes the foundation of the birth of the financial press. And Great Britain creates its own culture fluent in accounting. 1706, there are something like 30 accounting or writing schools in Great Britain. By 1800, there are 1,000. Britain is the center of accounting and financial management. And they have the paintings. These are the colonial paintings, right? The overlord, so content with himself that they can be flopped on the floor, his account books. And there's a whole, and of course there's Dickens in accounting. I literally taught a whole course on that. That's another fascinating thing. But try and get kids from a business school to read a 430-page novel. It's just too hard. By the way, that's another thing that we've lost, is how to read a 19th century novel. So what? Okay, well, the so what here, which is a good English tradition. When I went to university here, they always asked me, so what? Which is really the best thing you can ask your students. So what? So tell me the big picture. What do I have to learn here? The idea is that this accounting culture is necessary to functioning government. So one of the things that happened, and I know that I'll just go 3 more minutes, okay? One of the things that happened, this is the stock photo of an accountant. This is the problem. I mean, this actually repulses me. That's maybe because I live in the States. But see, this is my kind of portrait of the accountant, okay? This is the person I want running things. This is, you know, I mean, this guy's not going to blink at slave trading, but nor is he. So, sorry. Hey, come on, it's true, you know? This culture really has been lost. Accounting is not what it used to be, and you and I have talked about it and literally experienced it, right? And there are some accounting thinkers left in the world, but it just doesn't have the level of sophistication. It does in certain kinds of computing, but not culturally. It didn't have what it had. And yet we still need it. It's the only tool. It is one of the only pieces of actual gravity in finance. So far, we can't outrun accrual accounting or top financial accounting. There's no other tool to use to measure money. And money still follows those flows. So we still have gravity in finance, and the way we measure it is accounting. And yet what we have now is a hyper-financial culture in which people are financially illiterate. And they're also just illiterate, not just financially illiterate. They can't read Dickens. Maybe here in this town they can, but, you know, I mean, this country's not leading the world anymore, and it's not going to be a part of Europe anymore. It's important that people in Britain do it, but what about the places that are leading the world? What's the level of sophistication and the level of financial sophistication mixed together that it takes to run a society like this without it turning into something ugly or collapsing? So one of the things we know historically is that having accounting as part of the public language of politics was essential, because if you're unhappy with your politicians, I'm not going to ask you who here is unhappy with your politicians, sorry. And I'm not going to mention this government, or the American government, whatever's left of it. But, you know, if you're unhappy with your politicians, what do you ask them for? You ask them, well, you don't know what to ask them. You just get angry, And then in America, then you get racist, and here too, and then you just get angry and racist. And does that really help anybody? No. So the old culture is, one of them was to say, I want to see the books. And that's long gone, you guys. The Department of Defense does not use accrual accounting. It's unauditable. The Comptroller General of the United States said, I'm unable to audit any part of the American government because they don't keep proper books. So we're at a point of absolute crisis, even though you can't see it because we don't even know where to look. Now, one of the things that happened to me is I've been part of the standard setting group trying to put high public financial management standards in Europe. And one of the things I found is that the public's not going to ask these questions. So what you need groups, whether they be companies. Well, the big four don't like to ask these questions because they depend on government contracts. So they're not going to ask the tough questions. So one of the things I found is that, for example, I got sucked into the Greek debt crisis. And the Greek debt crisis was all about bad bookkeeping and, by the way, the bad calculations of the Greek debt, the stuff that the IMF does. I could give another talk on that, which is absolutely shocking and immoral and ridiculous, and you should see their new headquarters, paid for with the interest payments from the Greek debt. Should have never, ever, ever happened. The Greeks lost billions by stealing from themselves, and then the Germans and the IMF came in and started cleaning them out too. And no one can really manage it because the accounting is so bad. That's one of the reasons. So essentially, it took me a while, but I finally got to Cyprus, and I finally started working with this government. Greece went from having no internal reporting, no public financial management within the government, to the best in Europe right now in internal reporting. This means that he can ask for an audit of any part of the Greek government, and what they get is something vaguely resembling reality, which is all you can ask for. Okay? What we're trying to do now with Cyprus, and he's open to the idea, is that any decision he makes will be actually counted forward by accrual accounting, which says, look, I want to cut pensions or build a road or cut spending. What does that mean in the long term? And accrual can tell you that. And Cyprus will say, look, I don't have enough money or enough people or enough force to be able to do that. But that idea has become central. The financial management that they've been doing, a lot of it has been based on their Ipsos and what they literally just called their double entry reforms that they've been doing. And I've been working with that on them for 4 years. I'm going back to Greece in June to actually present their reforms to the Greek parliament through the story of the French Revolution. They've asked me, say, look, the parliament hates being audited. We need you to come in and once again explain to them why this works. And I said, well, which lesson do you want? And they said, well, you know, our party's Communist Party, so use the French Revolution story. I said, I'm in. So, but it's really interesting how we literally go over which historical story will work best. And we were talking about this earlier for you. So I'm going in June, on June 14th, to address the Greek parliament and give them a history of accounting reform in the French Revolution. A huge chunk of the French Revolution turned out to be about accounting reform. No one ever wrote that story. I found all the books about it in the archives, and I couldn't believe it. That's not what I had been taught. I'm working with the European community now, and one of the things we're finding is the public doesn't like accountants. They will not ask for these reforms. So what you need to do is convince leaders like Cyprus to support their ministers of public finance. You need to keep your good ministers of public finance. I'm not going to mention any names, but there was a very good Austrian minister of public finance who, as soon as the right and far right got together, they fired him. And he was an amazing guy. He went in and dealt with Iceland's meltdown. But as soon as he got fired, he started working for the IMF, and no one's heard from him since. That's what the IMF does with good public financial managers. It silences them. And it's another story. I'm really not a fan of the IMF. I'll tell you that right now. Okay? And I will not be offered a job by the IMF. I can give it. It's okay. It's okay. Although the IMF, boy, we've seen their books. My friends have audited them. Oh, my God. Anyway, they're breaking every one of their statutes all the time. But anyway, so it's not going to come from the public. This is going to be a somewhat top-down process that happens in weird ways. I've been in government settings. I've been in Brussels with the leaders of the European Commission, and people say, what are you doing here? you're a historian. Why are you in the room? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing here. But no one else is telling this story. But what I'm finding is that you need to convince the people at certain levels of government that this will actually, a lot of them don't, obviously they don't want to be audited. They don't want to be financially responsible because it ties their hands, or it limits their range of action. And they usually associate this with austerity. I'm like, no, this can also be about spending your money correctly. And I try and say this is not about austerity. This is about managing the people's money well, the investments that you'll make. So how do we get to an accountable society now? Well, over and over again, people have said, how do we educate the public? And I say, look, we're having a hard time getting the public to actually read properly. Literacy rates keep falling. France's literacy rates, France was 30 years ago one of the most literate countries in Europe. It's dropped 4 percentage points. That's not working. That would be great if every kid in school learned about accounting and was made financially literate and understood these things. So what do we do now? The financial press isn't even doing it. So what we're finding is finding ways to get into governments and to convince them that this will actually give them powers, that it will be useful for new parties to make this claim to incumbent parties, that we need to use this and you're being financially irresponsible and we want to audit you. And some are actually open to this idea. So it's been a kind of political tool that one can sell if one pitches it the right way. That's the only thing that I've found so far. And by the way, the industry has not been behind this. Been some activists, some people who really believe in this, a whole bunch of people from New Zealand where they've done this incredibly well. People like Karthik, who's fought for this stuff, and it hasn't been an easy fight. But I have found when you can get in there and get members of the government to really support this, it is incredibly effective and it works. And then slowly, it can turn into good policy. There's only one last problem, and I'll conclude with this. Who has the best balance sheet in Europe? The finest balance sheet of any nation in Europe. Oh, Germany uses cash accounting for the federal budget. They make up, Germany claims that they have no deficit. It's probably about 240 billion. But when you have no deficit, you borrow at lower rates. Germany uses cash accounting. Good pharmacies don't use cash accounting. Nobody uses it. I use cash accounting. I'm a humanities professor. The only people that use cash accounting, if any accounting at all. And Germany has fought against Ipsos in Europe. The Länder have some of the best management in the world, but not at the federal level. But who has the best balance sheet? Does anybody know? SIPFA did the work. You guys don't know what? No. Great Britain has it. Great Britain has it. The ICAEW and SIPFA working together worked for years to create the finest balance sheet in the world. And guess what the previous government of the same party to this party did with that balance sheet? Nothing, didn't use it. So that's the other problem, is that Britain has the finest tool for public financial management. And they say, oh, it's so imperfect. It took them years and years and years. An international team of people from New Zealand, people in Brussels, EU money went into it, by the way. Oh, no. What's going to happen to that balance sheet? But Osborne never used it. And the people who made it were shocked because they're not labor, the people who made it. They're not lefties. They're balance sheet people, I hate to say that, who are often conservatives. And yet the government didn't use it. And so we're still left with this conundrum. How is it that we have this country, which has the finest public balance sheet in Europe, and it's not used? So it's conundrum after conundrum. But you still do have it. If anybody knew that, one could run on that. So I guess I'd leave you with more questions to answer than I've answered. But it's ongoing work. And it's very strange. It's a very, very, very strange process. And so with that, I guess that's not a really upbeat note. But I'm a little jet lagged. So the room's starting to spin. And I'm thinking about Britain's balance sheet. But that's Dickensian. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Jake. That was stimulating as always. So we will open it up for questions in a moment. But before that, let me tell one of my favorite jokes about accounting. And it is a great line from Alan Bennett's play, The Madness of King George. And this is in one of the opening segments of the play where the gentleman usher of the Black Rod comes calling to the House of Commons, and Charles James Fox is the leader of the opposition, and William Pitt, the younger, is prime minister. And Pitt has this reputation of just being very, very serious. And so Fox asks Pitt, do you enjoy all this flummery, Mr. Pitt? And Pitt says, no, Mr. Fox. And Fox says, do you enjoy anything at all, Mr. Pitt? And Pitt says, a good balance sheet.
Yeah, well, that's true, by the way.
So
he did. He had made some of the best accounting reforms of anyone ever.
Fantastic. So with that, let us open it up to questions from the audience. And we've got the first one right here from Professor Murray.
Fabulous talk, really.
You got to wait for the microphone.
Oh.
Yep.
I said fabulous talk, thoroughly enjoyable. I'd like to know why the Dutch. The Weber, I've got the Weber sweatshirt, as you said. Weber says it's because they all want to go to heaven and wealth is a sign from God, so the Protestants work incredibly hard. Calvinism leads them to that. You scoffed at that and said it was the Catholics. So why Holland and not, say, Spain?
Well, I think it's because of the polder system. In the 1100s, the Dutch start taking the land out of the water, and they believe God is giving this to them. But I don't know if you know anything about feudalism, and you ought to because you're living in Britain, and you're living in a feudal institution completely. No, it's literally. I mean, it's got feudal charters. And so what happens is when they take that land out of the water, they're free, and so they don't have feudal lords. So these Dutch people are some of the only completely. There's been no charter. There's been no agreement. They haven't been granted their freedom. They have taken it. There's some saying in Dutch that what the water takes, the water gives, something like that. But it literally means freedom. So these Dutch polders they see them as their right to be free is given by God, but it comes from the water management. And so this weird engineering culture, which is really, really advanced there. I mean, it's also advanced in places like Italy, but this is unusual. They then have to manage it. So not only are they free, but in order to hold that land, they have to have the waterworks. And then from the waterworks comes this communal management system where you have to have the taxes to create pump systems, to create the dikes, to do all these things. And it's if you read the polder history, it's really crazy. And that's, this is the Middle Ages that this is happening. So is it the land that they work on? Look, remember, of course, the Dutch were Catholic before they became Protestant. But the people who are beginning this, there's no question as we get into the Reformation and past it, and we get into the Dutch Republic. Remember, the Dutch Republic, only the north part is Protestant. The south part, Nijmegen, those are still Catholic cities. And they're all rich together, and they're all investing in these companies. Now, for Weber, I could talk to you about the dissenters. That's also in my book in the 18th century. They fit Weber's pattern. But these guys are different, and I think it has to do with a society that's deeply communal, a society in which, as you see, people are working together, women and men, at statuses that are different than the rest of the world, and they're doing this hardcore water engineering. By the way, apparently it spills over into all of their charitable institutions, and those were the pictures of the people with the books. So the management structures from the waterworks will end up in the poorhouses and the hospitals and in the schools. But that taxation system initially becomes very, very disciplined because of the waterworks. Because what happens if you mismanage it? Everybody dies. That used to bother people. Now people are less scared of mass death. Sorry.
That's a climate change joke.
Well, or it's just like living in the United States right now.
Well, okay, we've got a question here. Just one line introducing yourself.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Qing. I come from China doing the contemporary Chinese studies. Previously, I did the politics as well. So my question is more about the politics of accountability. I like your argument, like accountability can be a good tool for the government to win support and trust from citizens. But I think what you mentioned is just one of the tools, like the public financial management. Actually, when we're talking about accountability, probably we can mean some other things, like we need some answers or justifications of the government, or we need to punish the government in some way, like the elections. A lot of political scientists, they think elections is a good way to make government accountable. So do you agree with this kind of definition? If so,
sure, it goes out from that, but the word and the actual cultural history of accountability is deeply ingrained in accounting. By the way, Taiwan is where my book sold. Well, actually, Japan sold the most, but it's a bestseller in Taiwan, and Taiwan's really interesting. In Japan, it was the government that embraced the book. In Taiwan, the population embraced the book, and that was just a very interesting, strange thing that normal people in Taiwan understood that, and they wanted accountability to be done that way by their government. Where in Japan, the government embraced it. It was just a strange, different cultures will embrace that story in different ways. But right, the problem is when we ask for accountability now, at the end of those questions, it usually comes down to some kind of financial management or mismanagement. I mean, to some kind of corruption or lack of good management or lack of growth, which is another story.
Okay. Question in the back over there. Oh, no, you got to wait for the mic.
Thank you. My name is Jose Maria Valenzuela. I'm a doctoral student, first year here at the Blavatnik school. So if I understand correctly, it was a very nice presentation. I'm complementing this with some readings I did from John Paget's work on the same topic or similar related topic. And it seems like it was very important, the fact that all of these citizens, local citizens or migrant citizens from the southern part of the Spanish or the Habsburg Netherlands own bonds from the empire. So that they would be active sort of shareholders on this decision-making by local governments, by sort of intermediate governments of the whole imperial structure. So it seems like sort of shareholding, it's important. So this leads me to think, and I would like to have your opinion on this, whether we should think of, you mentioned accounting reform at the national level, at the financial minister type of level, whether there are other institutional alternatives to sort of foster this sort of cultural reform. And I'm thinking on the case of pensions and pension funds, which are in the middle between private and public, where you can talk not necessarily of shareholding, but certainly on stakeholder. What would be your thoughts?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. One of the problems is that's one of the places where, that's one of the only sites where this happens to do with Social Security or pensions, where people say, that's my money, I've put it in, I want to understand how it works. The problem is that the banking institutions that have been, the money's been given to, it's very hard to understand how they operate. And we saw this, for example, with pension funds finding that some of their funds were, coming out of Panama, for example. So it's very hard for, I believe that even though the general principles of international finance are not necessarily that hard to understand, the mechanisms are actually hard to understand. So it depends what level of debate one has with pensioners and stakeholders in their in those public holdings. The debates that I've seen have not been very sophisticated. Most Americans don't even understand the way, American politicians will call Social Security a handout. Well, it's not. It's called the National Investment something system. It's literally, you invest, you pay your money into Social Security, you get it back. A huge chunk of Americans don't even realize that on their paycheck it says Social Security, they're paying in it. They don't even know that. So one of the problems is when you do get into those debates, what level does it go to? my last thought on that is, if you look at the American pension system, which is a disaster in the States, what politicians did for the past 40 years is they didn't give policemen or teachers raises, but they said, we'll give you higher pensions so we don't have to deal with it. Now, this is something that the right's angry about and the left isn't dealing with, and I think this is something the right's completely right about, is that these pensions cannot be paid. It's impossible. And the debates we have about them are not usually at a financial management level. They're about, hey, we want our money or not. And I find those debates to be depressing because they're at such a low quality. And that goes for Social Security in the United States. I'm sure those debates in England are not that different, in which if you look at the debate about general pensions and who's going to get what, people are not often asking the right questions, or they don't really understand the process by which their money flows or gets moved around. Fortunes are made moving pensions around, as you know. That's what a lot of what financial companies do, is move people's pensions around. So that's what investment banks, I mean, that's a huge source of, that's like a huge other topic of debate. What do investment banks actually do? They move around pensions.
We got another question over there.
Thank you very much for that. My name is Maya Koritz. I did my DPhil here at Oxford. Paolo Quattrone was my supervisor. So I know a little bit, though I study public accountability, slightly different, and I work in a business school, so resident business school person. What was really interesting to me is kind of, and maybe I'm oversimplifying here, but you seem to be suggesting in a sort of traditional principal agent problem that somehow better information leads to more trust, right? So if I understood it kind of, so if we improve the accounting system, that would allow us to know more and therefore perhaps trust more. I'm just going by your last slide.
Yeah.
What I find very fascinating is the fact of how that squares with this more of a sort of history of public scandals that we've had, in which it's continually proven to us that in the absence of all information, the public nevertheless trusts, right? So the financial crisis, you trust the market, the Bitcoin right now, everybody's investing, even though all the information is pointing arguably in a sort of direction of, look, you should be asking critical questions along the lines that you're saying, right? And irregardless of that, people perhaps bought by a bigger ideology of market or profit, whatever, are driven by something else. I wonder what to you, so what's your kind of, you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, well, that's a really complicated question.
I
Well,
know.
I'm thinking, because I've had versions of this, a whole bunch of versions of this. The first one that interested me was actually in Taipei, where some banker said, well, Bitcoin's just, or, sorry, well, not Bitcoin, what's it called? I just lost it in my head.
Blockchain.
Blockchain's going to make it all work fine. And then someone else was like, but blockchain doesn't actually guarantee the quality of the accounts. So it doesn't actually guarantee what kind of accounting is being done. And there are problems with blockchain. And someone said, look, blockchain just solves all this problem. Now we can just trust everything that's going to work. And someone else in the room said to the banker, no, that's not how blockchain actually works. And then that debate sort of took off on its own. The market is some kind of primitive god still. We know that. It is. And that's partially what my book is about. The idea of the market really does come from a post-Newtonian version of natural law. And so it has a deep faith in the religious chain of being, which leads from the heavens down to the wheat fields. This is my new book. So that faith is still somehow deep within us. And that's something that we haven't really studied much, and I'm trying to study that now. But we also now have, I think, a remarkable kind of, humans like to place their faith in things. We know that. And those things don't have to be rational. And so this leads to constant bubbles, this leads to constant problems. But I would say they don't have the information they need. So if you really sat and you looked at Bitcoin, although I just read today somewhere that Goldman is suddenly investing a whole bunch in, but when Goldman invests, it doesn't mean how they're investing because they hedge against their own bets. So you got to be really careful. When Goldman says it's investing, that could actually be a trap, right? But people don't really know that. I think what you're getting to, I would just say we're getting back to this idea of literacy in which people just don't really know what the basic terms that they're talking about. For example, what a free market is. People don't even know what that means, and what it implies. And the same goes for the market itself and trust in the market. And again, anyone here, if you talk to any captain of finance or captainess of finance or whatever, although there are not so many, right, because it's not the most open industry, they will tell you, of course I'm not going to invest blindly. I'll only do insider trading, or I'll go research it with 200 analysts. So, you know, the way the financial system works now is not such a great thing. It's problematic. And by the way, one last point, what can we really understand? I mean, when I see my friends analysts at work and how talented these guys are, I'm just like, nobody has a chance against this guy. Goldman does, and so does Morgan Stanley. But then they have so many people that they can hedge against themselves and build all sorts of strange devices that no one can understand and that can't be regulated. I mean, we could just argue that one out. I think it is a deep problem, and I don't think people in school are taught enough about the financial system that they live in. You can be for or against it, but everyone should understand it. I'm not saying we shouldn't have it or we should have it. I'm saying let's just understand it, and I don't think we're anywhere near there. The great entrance language for understanding this is accounting.
Okay. We got a question right up front here.
Thank you. My name is Rebecca Henderson. I'm a professor at Harvard visiting here, and I too am at a business school. Karthik and I hang out a bit. I wondered if you'd riff a little bit about the difference between transparency and auditing as tools of control.
Yeah.
And the importance of double entry and not doing cash accounting. Because those feel like different ideas, and I see that they're related, but politically, I wonder if one is more important than the other.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
So here's what I mean. I think persuading many politicians to use balance sheet accounting is going to be very hard, and you already told us why. Because they're running down future assets, and they don't want to tell people that they're doing that.
Right.
That feels to me a different problem, a very important and interesting problem, but a different problem from you don't understand anything I'm doing. You don't understand the cash accounting. You don't know where the money's going. You don't know how the finance system works. And so I guess if you had to put energy against, if you had to choose, if you had to balance your energy, are you really going to try and get everyone onto balance sheets, or are you going to really try and work on literacy and transparency? And I know you don't want to separate them, but I think they're different.
Oh, no, I'm with you. I'm with you. It depends, but I think it's a great question. And it's really, really hard. I think it's case specific. Because one of the things I mentioned, but I didn't make clear, is that it's opposition parties who might be the ones who sign on initially. And once they get into government, keeping them to act. Once they get in and they see the mess that they're dealing with, that they have no money to spend, out go the balance sheets and everything like that, right? But if you kind of can corner them into it, and that's what happened in New Zealand, but it was semi-accidental. I work with the people who created the New Zealand system, or what we call the New Zealand model, and they say it was an accident. It was a conservative government that started it, then the Labour government ended up having to actually do the reform, and they didn't really understand what they were doing. Now they have it. And of course, it's the best run country in the world. It's only 4 million people, as I try and point out. That's easier to do. And that's the size of my neighborhood in LA, you know. But so where do you do it? I think it really depends. I think generally it's just hard. I think generally it's going to be very hard to do. But I think it depends. I think that, for example, in Greece, we've been able to get them to use good management, but to actually create a balance sheet, no, that's different. They're not going to actually do that. So they've moved to accruals in their everyday management, but they're not creating a balance sheet. And that's what we've been trying to get Cyprus to do. And Cyprus might end up with so few options that he ends up doing it, possibly to screw over the incoming government if he loses an election. I mean, this is how it might work. It's not going to work in some happy, rational, forward-marching way. That I've learned, okay? But yeah, I mean, I think your question leads me to the sort of question of where are these sort of points you can find, you know, where you can actually inject this in and have it actually work. And that's what I've been finding. in each country, it's strange. America, I found a few really far right-wing nut jobs. Of course, now many of them, they're not actually even in this government. They wanted to do some of this stuff. In Europe, you can find more people interested. In Asia, I'm finding a lot of interest in it. But it depends which one. You're right. There are different forms of this. There's let's maybe say the managerial form and then the balance sheet form. Would that be the best way to do it? Balance sheet being the scariest. Nobody really wants a balance sheet. The managerial stuff, what historically I've shown is if once your managerial accounting gets good enough, you start ending up with a balance sheet, and that's when they kill the managerial accounting. That's the process. Let's see what happens in Greece. I mean, that's the one I get to look in. We've built a system from nothing. It's working really well. Even the prime minister gets it. And I'm going to be dealing with them very soon, and we'll see how, and they're trying to keep it going. But where that goes, this will be one of the great tests. Eventually, I mean, I hate to do this. I mean, I feel bad about it. I will eventually write about it once it's done, once there's a conclusion or not, because I get to see it happening, which is really unusual. What do you think? I'm just interested in where you think these systems can work, because you're right, most of the time it's not going to happen.
I would start with transparency. I want to know what the Department of Defense is doing. And I mean, to your earlier point, and then I might move towards a balance sheet, but I think a balance sheet is too hard.
Right. So, well, the thing is, though, is that people don't even know what to ask when they ask for transparency from the Department of Defense. So they give them their cash accounts. I mean, they literally hand them over. I wrote an article in Politico about this. In 2014, the Comptroller General, David Walker, he's running as a Republican for governor of Connecticut on his record. And he did an audit of the United States, and he wrote this thing to the Congress and the president and said, can't audit the country, it's impossible. And so I wrote a piece called One Nation, Unauditable. And I thought it was going to be, because I had his sheet, his audit, there's a like 280-page version, and then there's a 3-page version. I said, this is a smoking gun. When people hear about this is after the financial crisis, people are going to just say, this is scandalous, we need to do this, and I'm going to publish this article. And I got my hands on a public piece of information that everyone's overlooked. It was my least shared article ever. And I was just like, one unauditable, no one cares about audits, they don't even understand what they are. So I think that's the problem, is that literacy issue comes back again. Who knows what to do with the Department of Defense, which questions to ask? The experts. And there aren't enough expert activists for reasons of capture, mostly, and then illiteracy, and then, of course, the interests. I mean, the number of people feeding off of the Department of Defense, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Education, he found none of them were using accrual accounting. So the problem is no one has actually posed the question. I don't like to use that term because it actually means torture in the Latin sense, to pose the question. But to pose the question, no one's posing the question. And when you do, and I did, and so did Walker, nobody cares. No one even knows what you're talking about. So, I mean, we are really behind here. It's actually really scary historically. I hate to say this. I mean, historically, what I've found is countries that are that far gone are on the edge of collapse. And, that's historically what I've found. That's just historical data.
We have 2 questions. We're quickly running out of time. Oh, we may have 3. So let's just bring some questions together and see if we can get as many voices in. Go for it.
Hi, I'm Danny. I'm a doctoral student at New College. Question is, your talk made me think of another great American historian, Arthur Schlesinger, who said that the big enemy of society is complexity and organization, and that makes me wonder if this is not a question about literacy, but one of complexity. Is it not in accountants' interests to not make their work clear and concise? Is it not, in fact, the idea that it should be an ever-escalating tower of paperwork and numbers, and it should be as illiterate as possible? Is that not in the interest of the profession? And that is, in fact, what we've got, is this much an ever escalating opaque system, and it's not really about
Let me
literacy.
stop you from answering.
Thank
So
you.
we'll take a couple of questions, and then you can
answer
pull them
that
all
question better
together.
than I can, but yeah.
So we got a question here, and then I'll close with you.
But I'm going to forget because I'm old.
Don't worry.
I'm jet lagged.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Lucia. I'm from Colombia, and I'm on the MPP as well. I just wanted to make a very, very quick comment because I've been listening about this public budgeting during the last few weeks. However, what it's been shocking to me is, I don't know if you have you studied the case of Latin America, because I mean, for what I can see, it seems like we have a lot of problems with public budgeting in New Zealand, the US, Great Britain, but when it comes to, in the case of Colombia, for example, we have such a great accountability system. And our ministers get rid of their positions because they spent money on suites, which is kind of paradoxical because it's a developing country, but we have such a great system of accountability, and it's really well used by the opposition parties. So it's kind of...
But that's been a very specific and local process that also came out of a particular Colombian context, I think, no?
Okay, and then there's a sort of the question that people keep asking me about how Brazil spends so much money on auditing and still has, you know, one of the
Most corrupt systems in the world.
And let's take a final question from Professor Lucas.
Hi, I'm Deborah Lucas. I'm in the business school too at MIT, and I've spent my life pretty much being one of those government accounting nerds that you don't think exist in the US government. So I guess I just wanted to comment that I wish it were just a morality tale, but I actually think it's just plain hard.
Yeah.
So just
Yeah.
want to say that
Sure.
so accrual in a government context is really complicated because accrual means you're looking forward.
That's right.
But the rules for that in government can't be the same as in the private sector. So just, I feel like it's very important for the audience to understand that there is a lot of accrual accounting, say, in the US government. Social Security says what their deficit is. My thing has been discount rates, and the devil is in the details. I just wondered if you have, you know, kind of thought about how hard it really is and how much difficulty is part of the problem, not just obfuscation.
So those are two actually great questions to tie together. So a question about, isn't it simply in the interests of accountants to introduce complexity? And here we have the former chief economist of the GAO saying, but it actually, of the CBO, sorry, saying how complex things actually are. So maybe we can tie those things. Yeah.
First, don't overestimate the accounting industry. I mean, really, they're looking for contracts, and they're looking just to survive and for the partner income. I mean, I think there might be some of that, but I've also watched them completely come up missing in action for the Greek debt crisis, and that's because in Europe all your contracts come through the EU, and in the end Germany decides those contracts, and Germany doesn't want this looked into, period. So I think a lot of it has to do with capture, but it doesn't have to do with some incredible business scheme. Most accountants are pretty straightforward, and so are their contracts. It's just who's doing the contracts and what the contracts are for. Now, it also costs a lot of money to get all those accountants in there, so it's really hard to build control systems and to do it well. That's why the New Zealand model is problematic, because it's on such a small scale. So New Zealand showed it can be done. When the CBO was invented, I think we had a better chance at actually doing this. But I've watched Greece do it with almost no resources, and I'm now working with their Congressional Budget Office. That's who I'm going to speak to this summer. If Greece is on a very small scale, but it's also completely poor and bankrupt, I believe that if Greece can do what they have done, we can do better. I do understand how complex it is, but considering how important asset management is, especially in places like the Department of Defense, it would seem a great place to invest money. You'd get a huge return on good asset management. The problem is getting there. and also paying the people to do it. It's super expensive. One of the problems we've had in Greece is actually the Greeks don't have enough people, and when you have outside people offering to pay, because of the Greek experience, well, they've been robbed by themselves, but then they've been robbed by outsiders, is that they don't want any foreigners coming in and doing this, yet they don't have enough skilled accountants to do it. And they've been trying to train people. And that's been a really hard thing. And we've tried to get EU money for that, but then the EU comes and makes some specific weird demand right at the moment we think we're going to make the deal, and it all falls apart. The American context, I think, is sadder because over the past 40 years, we've lost all the opportunities, I believe, that we might have had in the 1970s. When we could have installed better systems. Obviously, Social Security is much better managed, and that's one of the other mythologies, that it's terribly managed. That, if I'm not wrong, is well managed, right?
It's a pretty easy system to
Right,
manage, and
right.
it doesn't have a lot of leakage.
Right, but that's not the political thing. The political thing, this is a mess, and we shouldn't have the state doing this. People should be managing their own retirement accounts. That's a good idea. But I do think it's tough. I completely agree with you, but one of the other things I've learned in this process is that is not, when we went into Greece, what we have done, we were told was impossible. And 2 years ago, I gave up, and I said, I'm not going to do this. I just want to go on vacation in Greece. I don't want to be involved with this budget process. And then suddenly we made this progress, and I was like, whoa, what I learned is you don't give up. That's helpful. The problem is you need activists behind you too who are obsessive and don't give up and fund your work. And I haven't found that in the United States. So it's also that civil society needs to be involved too.
So we come back to this classic issue. We've got an absence of competence, with the skill base, an absence of character, with all of the experts being so conflicted, and commitment from those who are, able to do this, to actually keep their nose to the ground and push the agenda, because it is, quite frankly, as someone who's spent many years studying this, it's the sort of thing that turns people away from you at cocktail parties. So you have to really work hard to keep people's interest and in the underlying subject matter, and it is. One of the reasons why I have such great respect for Jake is that he writes best-selling books on accounting.
I was going to say, it works for me at cocktail parties.
Which is a very hard thing to do, and what we need is good writing. When it comes to something as simple as good writing is just absolutely critical when we're dealing with pushing this.
Just 2 points. He made it so important. One of the biggest points of my book was the connection between the liberal arts and accounting before. Literature, philosophy, all these things were connected. That meant, and art, as you saw, the case could be made by losing a connection to culture. And accounting really has lost a connection to culture. Really seriously. This has been disaster for accounting, I believe. One last anecdote. Philip II tries to put in a central control system. He's completely bankrupt. He's running a world empire with one of the biggest budgets on earth, right? And he puts in this incredible, this is all in my book, incredible legislation, which I don't stop talking about, because if you read it today, you're like, this is great legislation today. They can't find anyone to do it. And the same thing happens in 18th century France. They say, well, it's just too expensive to train the people, so let's stop now. But they push it through. These ministers actually find some people. They train this team. It takes them 40 years to do. They've put in the central ledger, and then the king destroys it. And then they hold out. This office holds out. And by the time they actually keep it working and Philip II dies, when the new kings come in, they stop paying the office. So you can even get to the point we need to get to, it can still be destroyed. That's how hard it is. But it's one of these things that history is not supposed to repeat itself. And one of the things we're not supposed to look for as historians is recurring models. That's what people like to do in business and other things. Historians say that this is dangerous. But because of the gravitational quality of accounting, I think it's one of the few things that we can actually look for tumbling through the dryer of history.
Wonderful metaphor there. Okay, with that, let us thank Professor Jake Soll for making the trip out here and sharing this wonderful past work on the reckoning and this emerging work on free markets, the history of a dream. Thank you.
Thank you.